Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the gales of November come early? I'm Aidan Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Watch. It was just before 2:15 p.m. on November 9th, 1975, when the last few ounces of a 26,000-ton taconite shipment dropped into the cargo holds of what had, at one point, been the largest freighter on the Great Lakes. Moments later, Captain Ernest McSorely directed wheelman John Simmons to begin steering the freighter away from Burlington Dock No. 1, the largest dock in the world, in Superior, Wisconsin, through the bay and out into the open water of Lake Superior, to begin her 30-hour journey to the Soo Locks at the lake's southeastern end. It was a beautiful day, unseasonably warm with clear skies, and for the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald, on their last voyage of the season, the knowledge that an exceptionally long winter break awaited them while the ship would be receiving minor repairs must have made it all the more enjoyable. Bound for Toledo, Ohio, the Fitz wouldn't be the only ship making its way east from the head of the lakes that day. Within a few hours, she would be joined by the Wilfred Sykes and the Arthur M. Anderson, captained by Dudley Paquette and Jesse Cooper, respectively. Now, they made a perfect trio in some ways. Paquette was cautious and very attentive to the weather, while Cooper's crew often thought of him as cocky and overly willing to take unnecessary risks. In the middle was the cool, confident, and of course competitive Captain McSorely, trusted implicitly by every man on his ship to get them where they needed to go, no matter how difficult the journey. The differences between the three men showed early, too. McSorely and Cooper, hunting the bonuses which came with quicker delivery times, planned to follow the standard southern route along the Wisconsin and Michigan coasts. Behind them, a familiar storm known as the Alberta Clipper threatened to turn the Fitz's last trip of the season into something less pleasant than the last few unseasonably warm days would have indicated. But it was nothing that the ships, captains, or crews hadn't seen before. If everything went according to plan, they might even beat the storm altogether. Paquette, on the other hand, opted to take the Sykes along the northern route across the lake, which offered greater shelter from whatever weather Superior might throw at them, but at the cost of an additional 14 hours. Though at first it seemed that Paquette was playing it too safe for his own good, risking the wrath of the company over a routine storm, McSorely and Cooper soon began to realize that the weather was going to be worse than they'd anticipated. Despite the mild conditions over the preceding couple of days, things weren't quite what they seemed. For about a week, the National Weather Service had been tracking a low-pressure system which originated in California and had been moving northeast across the United States, where it crossed into Kansas on Sunday morning. And of course, it probably should be mentioned that this is an unusual pattern for a storm to take. Perhaps that's why the National Weather Service initially expected it to pass just beneath Lake Superior on Monday night, but the storm had been picking up speed all day, and by Sunday evening it had already reached Iowa, prompting the NWS to issue a gale warning. If it kept up its pace, the warm, moisture-heavy system would reach the lake earlier than anticipated, and with that storm would come winds reaching 40 to 55 miles per hour, and waves up to 10 feet high. Now, sturdy as she was, the Edmund Fitzgerald had only 11.5 feet of freeboard, which is the space between the waterline and the deck of the ship when fully loaded, which left little room for error in these conditions. So, 63-year-old Captain McSorely, planning to retire at the end of this last voyage, opted to make the safe choice and follow Paquette along the safer, more sheltered northern route, and Cooper followed suit. This safety came with a caveat, however. McSorely, even after decades at the helm, was not nearly as familiar with the northern route, taking it only once or twice per season. Furthermore, instead of having the wind at their backs and the waves traveling with them for the entire trip, they would have to endure broadside winds for the final third of their journey as they churned towards Whitefish Bay. But if it meant avoiding the worst of the storms, the northern route was the lesser of the two evils. As the hours ticked by and Sunday the 9th gave way to Monday the 10th, Fitzgerald, Anderson, and Sykes were steaming their way along the southern coast of Ile Royale on the Canadian side of the lake. By then, it was becoming more and more evident that the conditions were going to be worse than anyone had anticipated, and as 1 a.m. rolled around, wind speeds rose to over 40 miles per hour, with gusts as high as 60. The gales of November had arrived, and with them the 10-foot waves which McSorely had hoped to avoid. For Paquette's part, he had seen enough to conclude that even the northern route wouldn't be safe, and decided to risk the displeasure of his employers in favor of the safety of his crew by pulling into harbor in Thunder Bay, Ontario for the night. McSorely, on the other hand, wasn't quite so concerned. As he saw it, they were still close enough to Ile Royale for the island to shelter them from the worst of the weather, and aboard the Anderson, Captain Cooper saw it no differently. But that began to change about an hour later, when the NWS upgraded their gale warning to a storm warning at 2 o'clock a.m., forecasting winds well beyond 55 miles per hour, and with them waves cresting as high as 15 feet. As it turned out, they were actually lagging. Anderson and Fitzgerald were already being battered by 58-mile-an-hour gusts and waves to match. But still, the mighty vessels trudged on, and 4 hours later, as dawn broke, the 700-foot ships were still running, now parallel to the Ile Royale coast and about 15 miles south of the island. The storm hadn't let up, author John Bacon of The Gales of November writes. But it hadn't gotten any worse for the Fitzgerald either. The sentiment from the Fitz matched that perspective when they sent in their weather report at 7 a.m., listing winds reaching 40 miles per hour, overcast skies, visibility at 2 to 5 miles, and continuous moderate rain, a temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and waves of 10 feet. 20 minutes later, the ship reported in to Columbia Transportation's headquarters in Cleveland to inform them of the change of plans and give them an updated arrival time of indefinite at the Sioux Locks in Sault Ste. Marie. Shortly thereafter, McSorely adjusted the ship's heading ever so slightly southward towards Pukasqua Depot, a ghost town along the eastern shore of Superior, aiming to cut across the open water and make for the coast as quickly as possible. Now, this was a very routine maneuver for the northern route, and they succeeded, reaching the coastline a few hours later and well ahead of the Anderson. McSorely executed a 90-degree turn to bring them into the home stretch, heading now due south towards Michipicoten Island. Not willing to be outdone, Cooper executed the same maneuver at 11 o'clock a.m., but about 25 miles earlier than the Fitzgerald had, about 25 miles to the west, cutting the distance between the two ships by a significant margin. By 1 o'clock p.m., shortly after the Fitz completed its southward turn, she was 11 miles northwest of Michipicoten Island, with Anderson hot on her tail about 7 miles back. 40 minutes later, the Fitz passed the island 3 miles out from its westernmost point, and with that, they found themselves coming up on one of the most hazardous portions of the northern route, a stretch of shallow, poorly charted water known as 6 Mile Shoal off the coast of tiny Caribou Island. Named for its depth, 6 Fathom Shoal is a 36-foot deep, 2.5-mile long north-to-south stretch of low water, which, in reality, is just 11 feet deep in some places. For the Fitzgerald and her 27 feet of draft, that presented a very significant danger, and one which McSorely needed to avoid at all costs. He might have, in fact almost certainly would have managed to do so, if not for the worst possible thing happening at the worst possible time. As the Fitz chugged towards Whitefish Point, winter arrived on Lake Superior. You see, at almost exactly the same time that the Edmund Fitzgerald was churning towards Caribou Island, the edge of the Alberta Clipper, which had been following them east, crashed into the outskirts of the low-pressure system moving upwards from the southwest. And at that moment, everything went to hell. Waves exceeding 15 feet battered the sides and deck of the ship, blinding snow left the pilothouse relying on their instruments, and as they inched closer to Caribou Island, they discovered that the lighthouse had gone dark. Now 15 miles behind McSorely and his crew, Cooper and his wheelsman watched in horror as the gray blip on a black background, representing the Fitzgerald, seemed to run directly over 6 Fathom Shoal, then slip too closely down the east side of Caribou Island. And then, somehow, it kept going. By some miracle, it appeared that the Fitzgerald, overloaded and pushing the limits of the already lowered Plimsoll Line regulations, managed to avoid catastrophe as she steamed past the hazard. At least, it seemed that way until around 3:30 p.m., when McSorely called Cooper over the radio to report that he had sustained some topside damage. Though it looked like they'd avoided any serious damage heading over the shoal, there was nothing they could do to stop the relentless onslaught of ever-growing waves. "I have a fence rail laid down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list," explained the Fitzgerald captain. "I'm checking down," which meant that he was going to slow the ship. Now, he'd said it calmly enough, with the typical cool and collected intonation of a Great Lakes captain, but Cooper was a captain too, and he knew that what McSorely hadn't said was just as important as what he had. The fence rail itself was essentially a non-issue, and the vents weren't large enough to flood the ship faster than the pumps could bail her out. But a list meant something more serious was at play. So, given that collection of problems, in saying he was checking down, McSorely was really indicating something else. He needed the Anderson to catch up to him, and fast. Cooper didn't hesitate to oblige, ordering the engineering crew to push the Anderson to full speed. They would need it because, as relaxed as McSorely might have sounded, both captains knew things were looking bad, and they were about to get worse. At 4:10 p.m., McSorely radioed the Anderson to report that both his long and short-range radar were disabled, and with the snowstorm obscuring everything around the pilothouse, that meant that he was sailing blind. To make matters worse, as the Fitz crawled towards Whitefish Bay, now just 35 miles away, they learned that the navigation beacon at the Coast Guard station at Grand Marais had been knocked out of commission by the storm, eliminating any chance of being guided in from the shore. So this left them reliant on the Anderson to direct the Fitzgerald's course, and while that ship was gaining ground, it was still over 15 miles behind them. As the waves turned the minutes to hours, the ships found themselves in an impossible race between making it to Whitefish Bay before the Fitz sank and having the navigational assistance required to not run aground before they did. Just after 5 p.m., McSorely put out the call for aid from any other potentially nearer ships, but found himself out of luck even after contacting Captain Woodard aboard the Avafors. Though Woodard reported that the Whitefish Bay lighthouse was operational, he was actually wrong. The storm, which was actively sinking the Fitzgerald, had also ravaged the coastline with 70-mile-an-hour winds, knocking out power as it went. The call to Woodard had actually been worse than useless, and the Avafor's captain's next question put on display precisely how much those not on the lake were still underestimating the weather. "The wind is really howling down here," Woodard said. "What are the conditions where you are?" He received no answer, but did catch McSorely inexplicably shouting at someone, "Don't let nobody on deck." Woodard, confused as to why that would even need to be said at a time like this, asked him to clarify, only to hear McSorely, putting aside his stoic facade, reply, "I have a bad list, lost both radars, and am taking heavy seas over the deck." Heavy seas was an understatement. By 6 o'clock p.m., the waves crashing over the Fitz were now throwing 25 feet or higher of green water, not sea spray, over the ship. And with every successive 25-footer, the chance of something worse grew greater. It was only a matter of time until a 50-foot-tall rogue wave appeared on the horizon, heading straight for all 11 feet of the Fitzgerald. Worse still, the waves were now so high that they obscured the Fitz's radar signature to the point where the Anderson could no longer consistently see them. At this point, as Bacon puts it, the question no longer was whether the Fitzgerald could withstand such relentless punishment, but how long until she succumbed. McSorely knew that, and in a last-ditch effort to get help, he contacted the Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie, where Petty Officer Philip Branch answered the desperate call. And then, in a stunning display of incompetence, Branch somehow managed to completely underestimate how serious the situation was, and did not pass on McSorley's concerns, offer any help, or alert anyone else at the station. It would not be the last time that evening that Philip Branch failed to do his duty. And by 7 p.m., everything was looking hopeless. But just when all seemed lost, Cooper radioed over to the Fitzgerald. They had the Fitz on radar once again, and could finally guide the stricken ship into the relative safety of Whitefish Bay. Miraculously, McSorely had managed to keep the Fitz on track despite everything, and Cooper told him that his course needed only a slight adjustment. But moments later, another hazard arose, prompting another call from the Anderson. The Anderson's first mate, Morgan Clark, was the first to speak, and said, "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Have you checked down?" McSorely replied, "Yes, we have." Clark said, "Fitzgerald, we are about 10 miles behind you and gaining about 1.5 miles per hour. Fitzgerald, there is a target 19 miles ahead of us, so the target would be 9 miles ahead of you." The reply, "Well, am I going to clear?" The answer, "Yes, he is going to pass to the west of you." McSorely said, "Well, fine," and then Clark asked, "By the way, Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problem?" To which McSorely replied the famous line, "We are holding our own." Finally, Clark ended the conversation with, "Okay, fine, I'll be talking to you later." Or so he thought. Half an hour to 45 minutes later, Anderson once again had lost sight of the Fitzgerald on radar, and First Mate Morgan Clark put out yet another call over to McSorley's limping ship. There was no response. It's possible that without Gordon Lightfoot's song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, not many people outside of the Great Lakes would even be aware of the story of this ship. And it might seem odd at first glance that anyone would bother to write a song about the capsizing of a cargo boat during a storm. I mean, it's not like that kind of thing had never happened before, and no songs were written about the Bradley, the Cedarville, or the Morrill, or any of the other ships that have gone down in the Great Lakes over the last 200 years. So what made the Edmund Fitzgerald so worthy of Gordon Lightfoot's attention? Put simply, it was the Titanic of the Great Lakes, a state-of-the-art ship which not only offered unprecedented efficiency to investors, but also the size and scale to attract crowds of onlookers whenever it passed by. For executives of operator Oglebay Norton's potential customers and partners, who were frequently offered trips on this majestic 4-star hotel on the seas, it was an even greater attraction, with its luxurious VIP suites and gourmet galley. For the crew, it was the greatest experience one could possibly have while working in such a grueling industry, as they lived in carpeted cabins with televisions, air conditionings, and all the accoutrements so commonly passed over by shipping companies in favor of profit. For those who lived along the locks and by the ports the Fitz so often visited, it was simply a magnificent sight to behold. And it helped that the ship's captains, over the years, played into the hype surrounding this boat. This was especially true in Sault Ste. Marie, where the Fitz passed through the mighty Soo locks every few weeks as it traversed a route spanning from the western extreme of Lake Superior all the way down into Lake Erie. Though she was just one of many ships which followed that route, the Fitz was always the fan favorite, and for good reason. When Northwestern Mutual commissioned the vessel in 1957, the allure was all part of the plan. Good pay and better cabins attracted crewmen who were proud to say they worked aboard the Fitz, and meticulous about keeping the ship's aesthetic features in pristine condition. Captains such as Peter the Commodore Pulser made a habit of using the megaphone to tell onlookers of the ship's adventures as they sailed through each port, wake vacationers at lakeside campsites, and play a ship-bound Santa Claus during the December stops. When Gordon Lightfoot referred to her as the pride of the American side, he wasn't exaggerating. The Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't just a floating 4-star boutique hotel which could also carry thousands of tons of iron ore. It was a veritable tourist attraction. There was no better marketing. But of course, it wasn't just the marketing. The Fitz was more than a pretty face. In her first season, the 729-foot-long freighter set a new record for the largest single cargo for one trip, at 22,509 long tons. Then, a year later, she did it again, this time at 22,943 long tons. That is 45,886,000 pounds. Or, to put it in, another way to understand the measurement, 11,411 Ford F-150s. For the Canadians in the audience, that is the equivalent of 122,362,666 hockey pucks. For everyone else, that's about 20,813,639 kilograms. Unfortunately, the Fitz's single cargo record would be broken in 1960 by the one ship on the lakes which could compete, her sister ship, the Arthur B. Homer, which went on to break its own record in 1961. Even with that defeat, the crew of the Fitz could take pride in the fact that for 4 years straight, they'd had the largest single-season haul. But then, in 1962, both vessels were trumped by the Edward L. Ryerson, which took not only the record for largest single cargo, but also the greatest amount of freight carried in a single season. But not for long. See, what made the Edmund Fitzgerald truly special was the men on board, and they weren't going to take these insults lying down. In 1964, the pride of the American side broke the ceiling by carrying more than 1 million gross tons of ore through the Soo locks in a season, and kept the crown in 1965 and again in 1966. Now, the Ryerson did manage to sneak by her in 67, only to see the Fitz blazing by at 1.2 million tons in 1968, with no sign of slowing down. She held on to the title in 69, 70, and even into 1971. It didn't matter who launched what. The Fitz and her crew managed to outdo them all, at least for a time. See, as good as the captains and crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald were, the ceaseless march of technological progress was bound to eventually lay them low. And in 1972, their reign met an insurmountable challenge with the launch of Bethlehem Steel's Stuart J. Court. Built to fit the Soo's newly expanded Poe lock, the Court was a 1,000-foot-long behemoth, and there was simply no way for the former giant of the lakes to compete. Where Fitzgerald broke her own seasonal haul record in 1971 with 1.3 million long tons, writes Bacon, in the Court's very first shipping season the next year, she carried 2.1 million long tons, 62% higher than the Fitzgerald's highest mark. With 1,000-foot-long ships taking to the water, there would be no more Great Lakes records for the Edmund Fitzgerald, marking the end of her supremacy. But this was also the beginning of a new era, and for the first time in 6 years, a new captain. And speaking of new eras, we'd like to introduce you to a change that you might be looking to make if you're engaging in a certain kind of bad habit. And that thing is fume. Now, we've been advertising this little wooden and steel puppy for a while now, and like 2 years, and there's a reason for that. It's because we genuinely support the mission this product has. You see, fume is it's a bad habit replacer. And the idea is that it's very hard to break habits, especially ones that we've formed over many, many years. So what if the way to get rid of your bad habit is to start by just getting rid of the bad part? And that is fume's mission put into a simple package. Instead of engaging in a certain other bad habit that might involve something with smoke or tar or electronics or vapors, you just take this little guy right here, which has a little fiber stick in it with some natural flavoring, goes in here, a little dial on the back right here. It works as a fidget toy too. You can't hear it probably, but it's nice. And then rather than having any sort of stuff going into your lungs, you just get air. It's the same motion, the same sensation, because that flavor really fills your lungs. And then you exhale and there's nothing that came out with it. Nothing to get trapped inside of your lungs, nothing to get trapped inside of your mouth or cause certain diseases that you don't want to get involved with. Nothing that, I don't know, needs some sort of filter to prevent disgusting things from getting inside of your body, other than the disgusting things already getting inside of your body. And one of the great things about something like this is there's a physical attribute to it that every time you use this instead of, something else, you can chalk that down to another concrete time that you didn't do the other thing. So if you are ready to work on kicking your bad habits, you can start by going to tryfume.com, that is tryfum.com/lorelodge to get your journey pack today. And when you do, it'll come with a free topper, which is a little silicone thing that goes up on top of here. So you get a little bit of a different mouthfeel, and it helps to keep the device clean. So, like I said, if you are ready to start working on kicking your bad habits, go to tryfume.com/lorelodge or click the link in the description to get started today. If being a Great Lakes captain were an Olympic pentathlon consisting of 5 events, writes Bacon, McSorely would probably win piloting, racing, recruiting, and leading his crew, and finish high enough in the 5th event, VIP Relations, that no other Great Lakes captain could challenge him for the top spot on the podium. It may sound like hyperbole, but it's not hard to believe once you read up on the guy. When he took command of the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1972 at the age of 59, Ernest McSorely had been sailing America's massive freshwater seas for over 40 years, and he'd spent more of them as a captain than anything else. Like most sailors of the day, he'd started young, fresh out of high school, but McSorely had been special. Where others of the time might take decades to work their way up the ranks, the Canadian-American out of Spencerville, Ontario, was just 31 years old when Columbia put him in charge of the SS Carrollton, making him the youngest captain on the Great Lakes. By the time he took command of the Fitz in 1972, those extra years of experience had made him the best at just about everything. But as a pilot, he was second to none, and the companies loved him for it. McSorely could pull maneuvers that other captains could only gawk over, such as backing into the docks at Silver Bay instead of pivoting around to go in front first, shaving 45 minutes off the procedure. On the open waters, he was even more impressive. As captains came off the lakes and into the Soo locks, they often found themselves vying for position. Time was money, and losing the race for the locks to another vessel could mean delays of hours or even days. But McSorely didn't often lose. One former deckhand, Craig Sullivan, recalled how on one trip back from Lake Huron, the Fitzgerald found itself vying for a spot in the locks against the Cliff's Victory, an older but much faster ship with a top speed of 20 miles per hour to the Fitzgerald's 16. In spite of a 20% deficit in capacity, McSorely managed to weave his way between other vessels and into position before the faster, more powerful Victory ship could claim the spot. The captain wasn't only good at piloting the ship in a literal sense either. While McSorely was in charge, the Fitz managed to continue its streak of breaking its own records, and not only due to his skill as a pilot. Though not the showman Captain Pulsar had been, Ernest McSorely wasn't about to let the Fitz's reputation lose its luster, and that meant keeping hold of the best crewmen on the lakes. something he did by being the best leader a sailor could ask for. Probably one of the most meaningful examples of that comes from Rick Bartoli, who was serving as second engineer on the Anderson on the night that the Fitzgerald went down with all hands. "I never met McSorely," he told Bacon, "never worked for him, but your reputation gets around pretty fast on the lakes, and I never heard a bad word." And those who did work for the man had even higher praise to give. For Craig Elkfist, who served as deckhand under McSorely in 1974, the Fitzgerald's captain and crew ranked up there with the money and the food as the best reasons to stay on board. 22 years old at the time, Elkfist remembered the captain for how he treated those under his command. "So long as you did your job," he told Bacon, "he left you alone. He wasn't sitting there nickel and diming you on stupid stuff. He let you do your job, and if you got it done right, that's all he cared about." Reading through the testimonies from Elkfist and others, it's clear that McSorely had the respect of his crew, and in large part due to the lack of an ego, which so many of them had to deal with on other ships. "He didn't talk much," Elkfist said, "but he'd say hi to you, he'd know your name, and he never yelled." Craig Sullivan had similar memories. Arriving aboard the Fitz as a cadet from the Great Lakes Maritime Academy in 1972, he anticipated being treated poorly. "Most captains despised cadets as know-nothing college kids and treated them accordingly," writes Bacon. So when Sullivan went to introduce himself to McSorely, he was anxious and prepared for the worst. But instead, the 60-year-old sailor waved him right in, and when he heard Craig's last name, joked that, "We've got the Irish Mafia on this one. O'Brien, McCarthy, McSorely, Sullivan, you'll fit right in." McSorely, Sullivan said, was a hell of a captain. By all accounts, he was also one hell of a man in general. Like 6 other members of Fitzgerald's returning crew, McSorely and his wife Nellie lived in what was back then a booming Toledo, Ohio. And whenever he was home, he made certain to spend every possible minute with her. Whether it was the 3-month winter hiatus or just a 14-hour stop to load and unload, the moment the Fitz docked in Toledo, former deckhand Terry Sullivan told Bacon, McSorely was on the ladder going down, and you didn't see him again until it was time for us to go. There was one thing he did for himself, of course, and that was treating himself to dinner at Mancy's restaurant. Captain was a really good customer, Gus Mancy told Bacon, and close to Uncle George, who ran the place. The captain would bring George fresh whitefish or pickerel that they caught on the ship and have it cooked at Mancy's. George was happy to do it. The captain's daughter, Dolores, she came in and got a job on her own merit and worked here for many years. Mancy's was their spot. It might seem odd that McSorely continued to work even at the age of 63, when he was long past retirement age for his industry and clearly wanted to spend time with his wife, but truth be told, it may be that she was the only reason he hadn't hung up the captain's hat for good. "I believe his wife was being treated for cancer," Sullivan said. "As much as he wanted to be home, McSorely was doing everything he could to pay for her treatment in the hope that one day, when he docked in Toledo for the last time, they'd go out for a celebratory dinner at Mancy's as the perfect capstone to a great career and the start of his golden years." When he set off from Superior, Wisconsin for the very last time on November 9th, 1975, he expected that dinner to be waiting for him when he got home. Ernest McSorely was a great captain, and that meant he attracted a great crew. Operating the Edmund Fitzgerald required 29 men filling 13 different roles, writes Bacon, and Captain McSorely was responsible for the other 28 men and 12 roles. Above the deck were the 3 mates, 3 wheelsmen, 3 watchmen, and 3 deckhands, and mates functioned as junior captains responsible for administration of the ship. Wheelsmen did the actual steering, watchmen, as it turns out, actually manned the deck, and deckhands assisted the watchmen. Below deck was the domain of the engine crew, consisting of engineers, oilers, a wiper, and 2 maintenance men. Engineers, as one would expect, operated the Fitz's 7,500 horsepower Westinghouse engine. Oilers had an even more self-explanatory job. The wiper cleaned up after the oilers, and the maintenance men did whatever needed doing. Lastly, there were the support staff, consisting of the 2 cooks, 2 porters, and a cadet. Cooks obviously cooked. Porters handled housekeeping and kitchen assistance, and the cadet was some kid from the Maritime Academy who was getting hazed and shown how to do boat stuff. Now, I could go into more detail about what each man's responsibilities were, but I think it's a better use of your time to talk about who they were as people. You see, as I was researching for this video, I found that there's very little out there regarding the 29 men who went down with the Edmund Fitzgerald. I don't think that's necessarily accidental either, but we'll get to that in a minute. But before we do, I want to take some time to talk about John McCarthy, James Pratt, Michael Armagost, John Simmons, Eugene O'Brien, John Poviach, Ransom Cundy, William Spengler, Carl Peckel, Paul Ripa, Bruce Hudson, Mark Thomas, George Hull, Eddie Binden, Thomas Edwards, Russell Haskell, Oliver Champeau, Ralph Walton, Blaine Wilhelm, Tom Benson, Gordon McClellan, Joseph Mazes, Tom Borgeson, Fred Beeger, Nolan Church, Bob Rafferty, Alan Kalman, and David Weiss. Among those sailing the Great Lakes, there were a scarce few men with the experience to match Captain Ernest McSorely, and wheelsman John Simmons of Ashland, Wisconsin was one of them. Wherever the captain went, whatever ship he was assigned to, Simmons would follow, and Bacon writes that it's fair to assume that no wheelsman worked better with Captain McSorely than senior wheelsman John Simmons. The two men operated almost as though they were one, so great was their connection after decades sharing the pilothouse. That connection extended into their personal lives, with Simmons' mischievous sense of humor perfectly tempering McSorley's stoicism to form the kind of bond which lasts lifetimes. The men were best friends, and that may have even helped humanize McSorley in the eyes of his crew. It also helped that Simmons wasn't just friendly with the captain. According to Craig Sullivan, while the man spent most of his time in the pilothouse with the mates and the other wheelsmen, he'd also come outside and lean on the rail to talk with me, a lowly cadet. Didn't have to do that, but he did. Much like the only man who could claim seniority over him, Simmons' love for the lakes came second only to his love for his wife, Florence, and he too planned to retire to their home in Ashland once this last run was over, where he looked forward to spending his twilight years alongside her and their two daughters. While McSorley ran the ship, he also knew how to delegate, and he knew that he could trust First Mate John McCarthy, a 62-year-old veteran sailor out of Bay Village, Ohio, to run the deck so he could focus on the responsibilities that only a captain could manage. It was to McCarthy that McSorley looked when he needed to rest, handle something for the company, or schmooze VIPs. Second and third mates James Pratt and Michael Armagost were competent, to be sure, but if the captain couldn't be in the pilot house for a difficult stretch of water, it was McCarthy who stood in his place. As a man, those under his authority saw him much the same as they did the ship's chief. Patrick Devine, a former deckhand, told Bacon that he liked McCarthy a lot and found him very easy to work with, describing him both as very competent and highly energetic. And when he was displeased with you, he was more concerned with resolving the conflict than lecturing junior members of the ship, something Cadet David Weiss learned after running his mouth to a VIP passenger one day in July of 1975. Rather than lecturing the 22-year-old over his insubordination, GLMA Professor John Tanner recalled how McCarthy, when he came to him, wasn't upset. He was soft-spoken and a very gentle guy, but he figured as David's supervisor, I ought to know. Speaking of David Weiss, it wouldn't be inappropriate to say that he was a young man caught between two worlds. A 21-year-old cowboy hat-wearing Californian from a Jewish family, he was a fish out of water when he arrived in the blue-collar, heavily Protestant Midwest. What drove him to seek the life of a Great Lakes captain is hard to say, but by the time he reached his early 20s, he was ready to get out of Los Angeles. Maybe it was some minor trouble with the law, or maybe it was his strained relationship with his father, but when he showed up in Traverse City in 1973, it was clear that he probably wasn't going to fit perfectly no matter where he went. Still, he fell in love with the region, and not long after that, he fell in love with Cindy LoCicero, a rising senior at Benzie Central High School in Benzonia, Michigan. While a 21-year-old man dating a 17-year-old girl would certainly turn heads today, back in the 1970s it wasn't quite as out of the ordinary. In fact, David was just one of several young men working aboard the Fitzgerald who had a teenage girlfriend back home, and all of them with the blessings of the girl's parents. When they met for the first time in June of 1974, David couldn't help but notice Cindy's long blonde hair, and Cindy couldn't help but notice David's big yellow muscle car. But it still took him 3 weeks to call her after he worked up the courage to ask for her number. Based on Bacon's account, Weiss didn't initially have the purest intentions with Cindy, but respected her wishes to take things slow and serious, and it didn't take long for him to go from trying to get her in bed to trying to get her to wed. It seems the latter actually spooked Cindy more than the former, but after a brief break and some time to think it over, she decided to give a serious relationship a chance. While David's personal life was falling into place, however, his professional life wasn't going quite as well. His youthful arrogance was wearing on some of the more senior members of Fitzgerald's crew, and his stunt with a VIP threatened to ruin the relationships beyond repair. It got to the point where Weiss actually asked to transfer to a different ship, and that left John Tanner to make a decision, one with consequences he never could have foreseen. Rather than letting David swap shifts and potentially have his reputation irrevocably tarnished as word of why he transferred got around, Tanner refused the request. Captain McSorely and McCarthy, those guys were all good to Cowboy, Tanner told Bacon years later. If we couldn't make this right on the Fitzgerald, where could we? It was a decision he'd one day have to explain to David's father face to face, but it was one the elder Weiss gracefully understood. David Weiss was just one of several young men working aboard the Fitz, including Bruce Hudson, Mark Thomas, Paul Ripa, and Tom Benson, and the last of those was probably the most similar to him. Like Weiss, Benson was an academy student with a rebellious streak and his own sense of style. According to Bacon, he sported long hair, high-top leather boots, and a long leather duster, like the coats gunslingers wore in Western movies. And while he wasn't conventionally good-looking, he had an air about him which earned respect above his weight class. John Hayes, who would one day ask Tom to be his best man, told the author that he wasn't like the Fonz, he was the Fonz. Unlike Weiss, however, Benson opted to take the engineering track at GMLA, which only deepened pre-existing disputes with his former sea captain father. That, and a follow-up decision to drop out of the academy entirely, probably contributed to what Hayes described as a fatalistic streak in the aspiring engineer, and one which it seemed might lead him on a trip to a dark place. But all of that changed when he met Cindy Gagnier. You may notice as we go through each of these men that all of their girlfriends were named Cindy. Like, all of them. The young men, every single one dating a Cindy. Cindy must have been the Aiden of the day. There is one situation in which one of the Cindys is spelled C-Y-N-D-I, but that's not the Cindy that the guy was dating. He was dating a Cindy spelled the normal way. Anyway, it didn't take long for Benson to propose, and shortly after that, he found himself assigned to one of the best jobs on the Great Lakes, the engineering crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald, where he was to serve as an oiler. Now that would make the best man issue difficult, but not impossible, and so the two men lined up their schedules to make it happen. Benson was to stand by Hayes' side as the latter took his vows on August 21st, 1976. An anomaly amongst the Fitz's more junior crew members, 22-year-old Bruce Hudson seemed to have his life laid out for him when he climbed aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald for that fateful final voyage across Lake Superior. Though, to be clear, he certainly hadn't planned it that way. In 1974, Bruce had been studying at Ohio State when he decided that he wanted to take some time off and go make some money. And normally I would make a joke about Ohio State, having attended the superior Big Ten program at Penn State myself, but now doesn't seem to be the time. And if anybody does get mad about that, we had a video 2 weeks ago going after Penn State for a couple of unsolved murders, and then in a week after this video, there's another video about an unsolved murder at Penn State, so you can't call me biased. Anyway, Hudson, seeking to make his money, took aboard a job at the Ashland, and was enjoying his newfound independence when his friend Paulie Spence asked him a question which would change his life forever. You want to go to the mall and meet girls? Bruce didn't need much persuading, especially since Paulie had actually already acquired the girls, Cindy Reynolds and Cindy George, both juniors at Oregon High School outside of Toledo. Like I said, this was apparently a lot more normal at the time. If there was any discomfort about the age gap from Cindy Reynolds' side of things, she didn't express it to John Bacon when he interviewed her for The Gales of November. Reynolds recalls talking with her friend at the mall, he writes, quoting her as saying, "When here comes Paulie," and he had Bruce with him, and we were giggling. She immediately fell for Bruce, finding his dark curly hair, brown eyes, and broad smile irresistible. He was very pleasant, she elaborated. I said it right then to my friend. He's a really nice guy, and he's funny. He was always funny. He could make you laugh about anything, and me and him just hit it off. Something clicked as soon as we saw each other. And of course, he too had a muscle car. Now somehow, Bruce didn't think to ask Cindy Reynolds for her number, nor did it occur to him a week later when the girls went over to Paulie's place to hang out with the boys. Instead, he just showed up at the restaurant where she waited tables a few weeks later, asking if she was around, and then when she got off. I can almost sit here imagining, having been a 21-year-old man myself, him talking to Paulie about how cute that Cindy girl is, and Paulie being like, dude, she likes you, and him being like, what? Because, I've had that experience myself. I think we've all had that experience. Some things never change. Anyway, when Cindy's shift ended, they went to Kmart together to pick up some new clothes for Hudson's next voyage, and that became their habit. He'd come by, pick her up, they'd go shopping, and then get dinner at Ponderosa's. But after a few weeks of that, Cindy dropped a big question on him. Do you want to meet my parents? And Bruce didn't miss a beat. he agreed to go over as soon as he could. Once again, if there was any discomfort about the age gap, Cindy's father didn't express it either. He shook Bruce's hand, and the two spent the entire night talking boats, and almost ignoring Cindy entirely in the process. Now, it does seem that Bruce always had good intentions with Cindy, as odd as that may sound today, and their relationship grew stronger and more serious as time went by. Soon, she was visiting him aboard the Ashland, where Bruce was living and working as a shipkeep while the ship was docked for the winter. The spring thaw was supposed to be the end of his time as a deckhand and would mark his return to Ohio State, but then he got the opportunity of a lifetime, at least as far as Great Lakes sailors go: a spot aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. Unfortunately, that stint didn't last very long, as a back injury forced him off the ship a few months later. That wasn't all bad, though, because it meant that the pair could spend even more time together, much of it in the room Bruce rented from Paulie Spencer. It seems that they may have spent a little too much time in that room, because in September of 1975, shortly after Bruce's back injury had healed enough for him to return to work, he got a call from Cindy. She was pregnant, but Bruce responded exactly as he should have. "That's fine," he told her. "We'll get an apartment together." She just had to wait for him to get home that November. Eugene Red O'Brien, a 50-year wheelsman with thick red hair and freckles, stood about 6 feet tall, writes Bacon. Of those 50 years, he'd spent the majority of them at sea, by a ratio of about 30 to 20, making him one of the more experienced men aboard the Fitz, though nowhere near as senior as his boss, John Simmons. Still, he was competent, and at more than just steering. Known as the Great Lakes Gambler, he loved games of chance and playing cards. And unfortunately for those foolish enough to sit down at the poker table with him, he was good at it. With the high pay made by the Fitz's crewmen, he had plenty to dedicate to the hobby, especially after losing his family to divorce. The hardest part of that, it seems, was the loss of quality time with his son. But O'Brien took Craig Elkvist on as a surrogate when the younger man joined the crew in 1974. Bacon writes that one day in the galley, O'Brien struck up a conversation with Elkvist, and that started their friendship. O'Brien would often take Elkvist and others to Tony Paco's in Toledo, where Elkvist would order their famous chicken paprikash with dumplings. "I figured he must have missed his family," Elkvist told the author, "and I was a substitute." The older man was always happy to treat his newfound shipbound son, and made a point of teaching him the ropes of the wheelsman position, even letting him steer the ship on a few occasions. "Red took me under his wing," Elkvist recalled. "He was more like a father to me than anything. Maybe that's why he didn't let me play cards with him." 53-year-old Ransom Cundy spent his life aboard ships, but he hadn't started on the Great Lakes. A young man at the outset of World War II, he had joined up with the Marines, fought heroically enough to earn medals and commendations in the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he must have liked life on the water enough to go right back to it when he came home after the war. Or almost. He spent 3 months in the copper mines before escaping to a freighter in 1945, and it's not hard to see why. Great Lakes sailors made good money, and that made it easy to support his wife, Betty, and their 2 daughters, Cheryl and Janice. Ransom also had the rare experience of working on the Fitzgerald long enough to work under both Captains Pulser and McSorely, and he came to be known as a friend you could count on, and a man who loved pranks almost as much as Simmons did. Sadly, all of that changed in 1974, when tragedy struck Cundy's family. On March 30th of that year, Janice's estranged husband broke into her home and murdered her before taking his own life, all while their 3 young children were in the house. That event broke Ransom Cundy, and he was never the same afterwards. He could have retired then and there, nobody would have blamed him, and he'd certainly worked about as long as anyone could expect in that industry. As he saw it, though, all he could do to escape the pain was bury himself in his work, and thankfully for him, the crew of the Fitz were happy to support him in any way they could. If someone told you to picture an engineer aboard a freighter, you would probably end up describing Eddie Bindon. A big man with a bit of a belly, the 47-year-old with a round open face was the kind of man you trust immediately. Patrick Devine could speak to that from experience. He'd first met Bindon in 1973 when both men were working aboard the Armco, Devine as a wiper and Bindon as first assistant. Despite the fact that they had little in common, the elder man quickly took Devine under his wing, and they quickly became good friends. That friendship continued when both men found themselves assigned to the Fitz in 1975, even though Devine had switched gears to work above deck as a deckhand, partially because he was filling in for Bruce Hudson while his back was injured. "He was my protector," Patrick later told Bacon. "He made sure I stayed out of trouble, and nobody bothered me." According to Devine, Bindon was a gentle soul, always giving me advice, telling me how things worked, and looking out for me. After 20 years on the lakes, however, Bindon had reached the pinnacle of his career with his promotion to the Fitz. And with that achievement under his belt, he was about ready to hang it up and retire to be with his wife, Helen. So, when everyone else was at the bar for the night before they left Superior for the last time, Eddie was out shopping. It had been 25 years since he and Helen got married, and he wanted to surprise her with a 2-carat diamond ring to commemorate the occasion. For some unknown reason, though, Bindon didn't take the ring with him when he boarded the ship on November 9, 1975. Instead, he left it with a friend and asked that it be mailed to Helen at their home in Fairport Harbor, Ohio. Perhaps he just didn't want it to get lost, or maybe he sent something in the air. Nobody will ever know. Oliver Champeau, or Buck to his friends, was overqualified for the 3rd assistant position aboard the Fitz, but he didn't really care. His years fighting in Korea had taught him the value of trustworthy comrades and a great commander, and so far as he was concerned, it was better to be of lower rank on a ship like this, under a captain like McSorely, than to be somewhere else with a little bit more authority and a slightly higher paycheck. Besides, the pay he received, even as the lowest-ranking member amongst the engineer crew, was plenty to provide for his wife Eileen and their only child Debbie, who had plenty to eat, nice clothes to wear, a solid house, and even tuition for Debbie to attend St. Pius XI High School back in Milwaukee. It was life he never could have dreamed of as a child, and that made the hard months spent away from his family worth every moment. Debbie remembers her father, and she remembers him well. He was full of love, full of joy, and always glad to be with me, she told John Bacon, recalling a childhood where her father, though absent 9 months out of the year, made sure to spend as much time with her as possible. When he was away, he'd send her postcards at every stop, along with care packages for important occasions like Easter, Christmas, and her birthday. He spared no reasonable expense to keep her happy, such as the $110 she needed for her prom dress and shoes, with only the expectation that she'd get good grades and behave as expected of a daughter from a good family. He was sincere about his rules, but never overbearing or unreasonable. And Buck had always been that way, looking out for his family above all else, even at the cost of his own comforts. As a young man, he'd taken over the responsibility of being the man of the house after his father passed away, and nobody had to tell him to do it. He saw his mother struggling to make ends meet, and decided to drop out of school to take on any work he could find in order to keep the family afloat for his 4 younger siblings. He was only 13 at the time. That spirit of selflessness never left him, nor did it stop with his family. According to Bacon, during the off-season, Buck would often drive by the Milwaukee Rescue Mission, which helped men who were down on their luck, and offer pay, food, and a warm bed to anyone who agreed to help him do some work on his cabin. According to Bacon, Ralph Walton, who went by his middle name of Grant, was a big man with a childlike smile and a warm, approachable demeanor. He was also, as his nephew Tom put it, simply not meant to be on land. Born in Sycamore, Ohio, Grant's teenage years were shaped by the Great Depression, and in the 10th grade he dropped out of school to go work on the lakes. His younger brother Wade, Tom's father, followed suit a few years later when he too turned 16. Without any formal education in seamanship, both of the Walton boys had to learn on the job, but if that was ever a challenge, it didn't show by the time Tom found himself working alongside his uncle aboard the Fitzgerald in the summer of 1963. As far as he could tell, the self-taught engineer's assistant, and oiler by title, lived and breathed that life, and wouldn't want to be anywhere else. For most men, life on board a Great Lakes cargo ship would be a difficult, utterly alien experience. But for 52-year-old Blaine Wilhelm of Moquaw, Wisconsin, it probably felt relatively comfortable after his years as a Navy fireman in World War II and Korea. In fact, compared to the cramped conditions on naval vessels, the Fitz's air-conditioned, relatively spacious cabins would have probably felt luxurious. That said, Wilhelm didn't start his career aboard the pride of the American side. After returning home from Asia, he'd taken a job aboard an ore freighter, the Reserve, as an oiler. It was on that ship that he met Frank Kobasic, who described Wilhelm to Bacon as a good, hard-working man and a real meat-and-potatoes kind of guy. He did his job well, didn't complain, and loved what he did. What he loved more, though, was his family. A few years after his honorable discharge, he'd married Lorraine Clark, and the pair got to work making and then raising 7 children over the course of the next 10 years. The first part of that hadn't been difficult. Daughter Heidi told Bacon that her parents were both lookers, but raising 7 kids on almost any budget is going to be tough. Being gone so many months out of the year, Blaine missed a lot of big moments, like teaching all the kids how to play catch, ride a bike, or drive a car. He made it work, though, and made a point of saving every spare penny, literally, as in he put all of his spare change into a Maxwell House coffee tin, so that he could give the kids some spending money whenever he came home. He didn't mind that they spent most of it on candy bars, and he figured that he'd make up for the missed moments by being the most present grandfather to ever live. When he stepped back on to the Edmund Fitzgerald in November of 1975, Blaine knew it would be his last time. He'd saved up enough to retire early and live out that dream of helping to raise the next generation of Wilhelms, and all he had left to do was earn his engineering's license. More for the ability to say he'd done it than for any plans to put it to use. The Fitz was an uncommonly happy ship, but Nolan Church might have been the happiest man on it. I'm gonna be honest with all of you, writing this episode took a very long time. I was up until 2 a.m. several nights this past week, and in that time I both forgot to write the rest of the segment on Nolan Church, and also spelled Minnesota wrong. I spelled it Minnestoa. That said, I do remember some details about Nolan Church, and I think probably the most important one is that the thing that mattered most to him the day before he left was to make sure that he got to see his entire family one last time. And of course, he didn't know this would be one last time, but he was heading out, and he made sure that everybody was together. They all had dinner. They all spent the evening talking and recalling stories, and then everybody got to say goodbye to Nolan Church. There are a few stories in here, like Nolan and Eddie Bindon, where you almost wonder if they knew. And of course, how could they? They can't have known. But the decisions they made, the things they did, it feels like maybe there was a premonition, maybe there was some sense. Maybe it was just that these guys have been sailors for a really long time, and they could tell something was off with the weather. Who knows? But I don't know, it's just, it's sad. It's really the only way to put it. I guess you just have to hope that there's a comfort for Church's family in the fact that for every single one of them, the last memory they have of Nolan is all of them, laughing over dinner together and then getting to say goodbye one last time. Bob Rafferty wasn't supposed to be on the Fitzgerald. At 62, he was happily retired after a long career as head cook, during which he'd spent a number of years aboard the Pride of the American Side. But as it turned out, in late 1975, the replacement for his replacement, a young man named Robert Bishop, wasn't handling life at lake so well. He developed an ulcer due to the stress, and with so little time left in the season before the Fitz docked for repairs in mid-November, McSorely and Columbia agreed that the best option to cover the position would be a veteran like Rafferty. So when the opportunity to join up for a quick 3-week cruise with some of his old crewmates came around, it must have seemed like a nice way to relive the good old days. What a joy, he might have thought, to cook aboard the King of the Lakes one last time. Now, when I set out to write this episode, my intention was to be able to cover everybody. Now, while there was a good amount of information to be found about the people I just listed for you and covered, there were some who did not have information readily available. Those are Mark Thomas of Richmond Heights, Ohio, Paul Ripa of Ashtabula, Ohio, Carl Peckel, also of Ashtabula, Ohio, Chief Engineer George Hull of Cabot, Pennsylvania, Second Assistant Thomas Edwards of Oregon, Ohio, Second Assistant Russell Haskell of Millbury, Ohio, Maintenance Man Thomas Borgeson of Duluth, Minnesota, Special Maintenance Man Joseph Mazes of Ashland, Wisconsin, Wiper Gordon McClellan of Presque Isle, Michigan, Frederick Beecher of Superior, Wisconsin, William Spengler of Toledo, Ohio, John Poviich of Bradenton, Florida, Second Mate James Pratt of Lakewood, Ohio, Third Mate Michael Armagost of Iron River, Wisconsin, and Second Cook Alan Kallman of Washburn, Wisconsin. And I felt that, even though there wasn't a ton of information, they all deserved to be named and remembered. Now, I tossed around a few ways of ending the chapter about the people who actually were on board the ship when it went down. And I came to the conclusion that the best way to end it would be with the story of what should have happened to the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald. While I have used some memorial sites and the official U.S. Coast Guard report from 1977 here and there in this episode, I've mostly been reorganizing and paraphrasing information from John U. Bacon's utterly phenomenal 2025 book, The Gales of November, which you should absolutely purchase and read in order to get the full unabridged story. The amount of work this man must have put in is incredible. This is one of the best books I have ever read on a topic like this, and again, I just cannot recommend it highly enough. I hope that those of you who can and those of you who have the interest will go and purchase this book, because he deserves to be a bestseller. I will make sure there is a link in the description so you can go get it off of Amazon. Of course, if you don't want to buy from Amazon, I understand, but make sure you go and find it somewhere else because it's 100% worth reading. But my point in bringing that up, aside from just to give credit to the man who I relied on so much to tell this story, is to say that I could do that again here. I could paraphrase, I could summarize, but this part of his book doesn't need to be paraphrased or summarized. I could try, but to be honest, Bacon's a better writer than I am. And so I think that for this small part, I'm just going to read you what he wrote. On Wednesday morning, November 12th, Captain McSorely would lead his crew through the last 60 miles of his career to the C&O pellet dock in Toledo. Blaine Wilhelm would be packing his bag, careful to secure the Maxwell House can of change he'd saved all season long, a small but heavy fortune he couldn't wait to bring home to his kids back in Moquaw, Wisconsin. Because the Fitz would have unloaded at Zug Island, she would be riding light into Toledo, carrying only ballast water. Once they tied up in Toledo, the crew members would hustle down the ladder to the payphone to call their families, this time to share the brief but reassuring message to their wives, children, parents, and girlfriends that they had made it through another strenuous season and would soon be home for 5 long winter months. The 9 crewmen who lived in the Toledo area would either be met by their loved ones or jump into their cars waiting at the dock. But more than a few of the locals would join their out-of-town friends for one last night at the Harbor Light, a brick box with no windows but plenty of cheap Stroh's Bohemian-style fire-brewed beer, and a jukebox with vinyl 45s of everything from Hank Williams to Motown to Michigan's own Bob Seger. And of course, brandy, which they would belt out together several more times that night while toasting each other on another great season. Buck Champeau's Oldsmobile would be waiting for him at the Toledo docks, ready to drive around Chicago to Milwaukee, where he would give his 17-year-old daughter Debbie, now a senior at St. Pius XI, a big season-ending hug, and a few souvenirs from his latest stops on the Great Lakes. Tom Benson and David Cowboy Weiss would call their Traverse City girlfriends Cindy Gagnier and Cindy Lo Cicero, respectively. Since Weiss would be turning 22 years old on Thursday, November 13th, the day they returned to Traverse City, that would be cause for celebration. On the 5-hour drive back, Benson and Weiss could daydream about hitting their favorite haunts with their GLMA classmates and rekindling their budding romances with their hometown sweethearts. Both had gone through some bumpy years, but now the road ahead seemed clear, and they were both as settled as they'd been in years, maybe ever. Deckhands Bruce Hudson and Mark Thomas, who shared the laborious job of securing the clamps with Paul Ripa on each of the ship's 21 hatches every trip, would be running to Hudson's gleaming burgundy 1974 Dodge Challenger to embark on their long-awaited road trip before Hudson came home to assume his new duties with Cindy Reynolds as young parents. But before the crew started their various celebrations, they would stop to salute and cheer their captain, Ernest McSorely, who would take his time getting down from the ladder for once, a noted contrast to his usual brisk exit to see his wife, Nellie, in the few hours they had. This time, he could revel in the knowledge that he had all the time in the world, an entire future just for Nellie and himself. He would drive directly to her facility, then to Mancy's for a long-anticipated celebration. And once Nellie was well again, back to their handsome home in Ottawa Hills. This time, for good. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hills. McSorely would finally be able to give Nellie the undivided attention she deserved and the care she needed. Thanks to the bonus from his last extra trip, he would have the money to do so. Fitzgerald would then hibernate in Toledo, where she would undergo her scheduled repairs. At just 18 years old, her best years were still ahead of her, and half a dozen or more lucky sailors would get the privilege of replacing the Fitzgerald veterans who would be retiring with McSorely. When the crew members boarded the Fitzgerald in Superior, Wisconsin, they would know all of this. Everything they had been working for all season long, and for some of them decades, was now just 3 days and 784 miles away. They were that close. Columbia, which is the transportation division of Oglebay Norton, did a great job of quieting this whole disaster down just about as soon as it happens. At least that's kind of what it looks like to me. For legal reasons, I'll say this is all conjecture, but it looks as though they took the classic route of let's offer the families enough money to get them not to sue us, and let's do it before any investigations can be done to show how this was our fault. The irony is that I don't really think it was Columbia's fault. At least not any more than it was anyone else's. But that's sort of a hard thing to explain if you don't understand precisely what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald. And because I'm not really a boat person, but producer Aiden is, I thought that I would have him do this chapter. So I'll give the floor to Thornbury.
The events of November 9th through 11th of 1975 over Lake Superior were treacherous, but not particularly rare or unsurprising. For many who are unfamiliar with the nature of nautical navigation, there may be a well-justified fear of the unknown in regards to just how a storm can take the lives of 29 well-seasoned men. My goal with this segment is to provide you with the scientific information to more comprehensively understand the extraordinary nature of what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald, but also what to look for when conditions like this arise in the future. And I say when for a reason. Before we get into the details of this 1975 storm, it's important for you to understand the factors of treacherous seas and how they form. And it all starts with the wind. Much of the information that I'm about to give comes from The American Practical Navigator, written by Nathaniel Bowditch. It was originally published in 1802, but it's been routinely updated and republished with new information. It's the gold standard for nautical navigation, and it's used by our commercial and naval sailors to this day. Thanks, Kellen. When air is still, so is water. Unless there's an earthquake that happens beneath the surface of the water, a massive chunk of land or ice falls into it, or the topography of the bottom becomes perfectly matched with the resonant frequencies of a tide, like that of the Bay of Fundy. But aside from those specific circumstances, if wind isn't present, then a body of water will remain still on the surface, held tight by the surface tension between the molecules. But when the wind kicks up, so does the water. Before we go any further, I think it's important to recognize that wind and water speed for most of the aeronautical industry, other than apparently the Great Lakes, they use knots as the form of measurement, which is a unit that harkens back hundreds of years into the tradition of navigation, and therefore will be the unit I use throughout the segment. If it's helpful for conversation, 1 knot is just over 1.15 miles per hour, so for example, 65 knots is just under 75 miles an hour. These speeds are also categorized within something known as the Beaufort scale, which has 12 levels to it. And I'm going to go through those levels to give you a little bit of understanding, especially when Mattis is talking about, gale force winds and things like that, to give you a little bit better comprehension of what exactly that means. So starting off, force 0 indicates winds that are less than a knot. And this is exemplified with water that is flat like glass, or if you're on land, smoke rising vertically from chimneys and leaves remaining still on the trees. Force 1 is called light air, when wind speeds are 1 to 3 knots, with ripples of less than 1/4 of a foot on the water, or the wind direction that is otherwise unnoticeable being shown by the drift of smoke in the air. Force 2, known as light breeze, has a wind of 4 to 6 knots, causing waves of about 6 inches to a foot, and the wind is noticeable on your face as you're standing outside. Force 3 is called gentle breeze, and it's a wind of 7 to 10 knots, causing about 2 to 3 foot sea, with whitecaps beginning to form, or continuously rustling leaves and small twigs. Force 4, or moderate breeze, is wind that is 11 to 16 knots, causing 3.5 to 5 foot seas, or causing dust and loose paper to be whisked about on land. Force 5, or fresh breeze, is wind that is 17 to 21 knots, building seas of up to 6 to 8 feet, and causing many whitecaps and some spray, or beginning to make small trees sway on land. Force 6, strong breeze, runs from 22 to 27 knots, causing waves of 9.5 to 13 feet, with whitecaps everywhere, or on land, causing large branches to move. Force 7 is known as near gale, with winds of 28 to 33 knots, building seas from 13.5 to 19 feet, with breaking whitecaps and spray streaking across the surface of the water, or on land, causing whole trees to begin to sway. Force 8 is when we officially get to gale-forced wind, blowing from 34 to 40 knots or 39 to 46 miles an hour, throwing seas from 18 to 25 feet in height, or breaking large twigs off of trees on land. At force 9, we have a severe gale, which has speeds of 41 to 47 knots and seas of 23 to 32 feet, beginning to roll and reduced visibility from spray occurring. This is also when structural damage to buildings would begin to occur from wind alone on land. At force 10, we are in category storm winds, with winds of 48 to 55 knots, or 55 to 63 miles an hour, with seas of 29 to 41 feet in height. Waves rolling in shock-like fashion, and visibility is reduced even further from spray. Or on land, this is the point when trees begin to be uprooted, and considerable structural damage begins to occur to buildings. Force 11 is a violent storm with winds of 56 to 63 knots, seas of 37 to 52 feet. The sea is nearly entirely white with foam and spray, and on land, widespread damage occurs. Force 12 is when we officially reach hurricane force winds. The winds at this point are greater than 64 knots, and seas rise to 52 feet and above. Air and sea are completely filled with foam and spray, and on land, extreme damage begins to occur. Now, these are the 12 levels of the Beaufort scale, but for those who are curious about categories of hurricanes, when we all hear about those in the summer and early autumn months, I also have them listed as well, just, for the curious. Category 1 hurricane starts at the level 12 scale on the Beaufort scale with the 64 knots of wind, but it goes up to 82 knots. The Category 2 is an 83 to 95 knot storm. Category 3 hurricane is anywhere between 96 to 112 knots. Category 4 is 113 to 136 knots. And a Category 5 hurricane has 137 knots or 157 miles an hour or above. There's no upper limit for a Category 5. As for how wind directly causes waves to form, I'm going to explain a little bit about how wind speed affects heights of waves. At 2 knots of wind or under, once the air stops, as does all the movement on the surface of any body of water that's beneath it. The disturbance of that surface is generally just called ripples. However, once you break that 2-knot limit, when the air stops, the water will still continue on. This is because once that limit is broken, those ripples form into more stable gravity waves, which according to weather.gov is simply because of their vertical nature, means that they're directly interacting with gravity. And if gravity weren't a present variable on the table, then the energy would simply dissipate tangentially from the origin point, kind of like a rocket going into orbit. These waves, created by the wind, are what's called sea. As sea carries on beyond the limits of the wind that forms it, those waves propagate in the same direction, mostly maintaining their height, but often increasing in wavelength and period. This is known as swell, which is important, but it's less relevant for this storm, as the constantly present winds maintained a seascape more than a swellscape. The direct correlation between wind and sea is well documented, and the most important variables for understanding the likely height of a given sea environment are the speed of the wind and the distance above the water of which that speed is maintained, called fetch. The greater the wind speed over a short distance, the greater the size of the waves. But as you extend that distance, those waves grow larger and larger and larger. There's a table in Bowditch titled 3802b, which shows this in prime detail. Winds of approximately 60 knots blowing over a 10 nautical mile stretch of water will generate waves of about 10 feet. But if you let that wind of the same speed continue on blowing for, say, 100 nautical miles instead of 10, those waves don't just stay at 10 feet, but they'll grow to 35 feet. And if that wind blows for over 600 nautical miles, still that same 60-knot wind, then those waves will continue to grow to an excess of 60 feet. With a length of 350 miles, this suggests that the largest conceivable waves on Lake Superior would be as high as 55 feet, approximately at least, at the very extreme edge of shoreline on the opposite side of the lake from which the wind was originating. Now granted, that's kind of ignoring a few other variables, such as how waves interact with depth of the water and what changes wave height in relation to that. We'll cover that a little bit as we move forward, but the 55 is a little bit more theoretical. It's probably closer to 45 to 50 if we're being realistic about how long of reasonable fetch exists on Lake Superior. But point being is that there's enough space for them to get pretty large. But in terms of that largeness, it's important to know just what is being measured when it comes to wave height. Waves take a form very similar to that of an inverted cycloid, which I'm hoping that Kurt can provide a GIF of for you. If not, no worries, but at the end of the day, it's essentially just the shape formed as if you were following a fixed point on a wheel as it was traveling along a surface. Now, the top of that path is called the crest, and the bottom is called the trough. The distance between the crest and the trough is called wave height, and the distance between the two crests is called wave length. You will notice that I just referred to this in the last section. There is something else called amplitude of the wave height, which is the height from which the stable level of the water is compared to the wave crest, and we'll get into a little bit of why there's that different measurement in a moment. The time it takes for two crests to pass a fixed point is called the wave period. So for example, if one crest passes, say, a lighthouse, and then you start counting the seconds until the next crest of that wave section passes, if it's 6 seconds, that would mean those waves have a period of 6 seconds. Due to the crests being steeper than troughs, which are more flattened out, the height of the same stretch of water without waves in it would be slightly below the midpoint between the crests and the trough, meaning that the maximum depth of water in waves decreases in correlation with the height of those waves. This will be important when we're referring to the idea of depth, specifically in relation to 6 Fathom shoals. This is also something, and I didn't add this in the script, but the higher the wave height, the lower the trough. Wave height also undergoes something unique as the water beneath it becomes shallow. As water travels over decreasing depth, the bottom of the wave will slow down due to friction on the bottom, causing the period between each wave to shrink rapidly. But since energy remains constant, it has to go somewhere, and the only place it can go in this scenario is up, raising the height of the waves even further than what they already were, and this process is known as shoaling. And as that height rises in a shorter period, the sides of those waves become steeper and more unstable, with the possibility of breaking. This instability is known as groundswell. This kind of environment can cause extreme roll in a vessel caught amongst it, especially if the waves are approaching broadside to its beam, and if the period is the same as the beam's width. With a wave period that is the same as the beam's width, you get a kind of instability resonance which can cause intense roll in even apparently calm conditions, not unlike that which happened to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, and that was just air. Additionally, as waves of sea are formed from the wind, they will each have independent speeds of one another. In instances where sea is able to form into swell, these waves will inevitably form themselves into sets of waves with similar speeds, as their group velocities match up and their energy propagates from the front of the wave to the rest of the set until it reaches shore. However, in a seascape, amidst constant blowing of wind, these waves of mismatched speed will at times overtake one another. And if you've ever been in a pool between multiple people splashing, you may have encountered a wave that dwarfed all others, seeming to tower over everything else around it. And this exact phenomenon is one of the causes of rogue waves, which occur when two waves combine, multiplying the energy and forcing it to coalesce in the only direction it can: up. And finally, in relation to the baseline weather condition variables, one important note is the power of water. Bowditch notes that a 4-foot wave with a 10-second period occurring over a mile of beach exerts over 35,000 horsepower on that beach, and that's over just one single wave. Now we can keep that level of power in mind as we think about what the Edmund Fitzgerald was enduring, but for now, let's discuss a little bit more about the ship itself. As noted plainly in the Gales of November, the design of the Fitz was for efficiency of moving ore, not safety. And efficient it was, and safe it was not. The hull's dimensions of 729 feet long by 75 feet wide meant that it fit perfectly in the MacArthur lock, but it also meant that it had a length-to-beam ratio of 10:1, making it look like a pencil compared to designs of similar tonnage ocean-going vessels even today, which are built with a much stouter 6:1 length-to-width ratio. The reason is simple physics. When you have a given material shape of a hull, there's a direct correlation of the strength between the cross-section of the beam and the length by which it runs. The longer and narrower a ship, the greater the force of torque experienced throughout the ship per unit of force that's applied to one end. To put this in a perspective that is easy to comprehend at home, if you take a broom or a mop in your hand, it's relatively easy to keep in the air. But if you grab that broom or mop by the tip of the handle, with the brush or mop end held away from you, and you attempt to raise it or hold it in an outstretched position, you'll notice that the force required will be far greater than if you're just holding it straight up and down. This is because the extended distance from the point of axis causes increased force to the opposing end, which is your shoulder, requiring greater strength to maintain balance in the system. The same thing happens in a ship's hull. If the bow of a ship strikes a wave, lifting the front up, the system becomes unstable and requires internal strength to prevent failure. This proved to be an unwinnable battle in the Great Lakes, as ships in the early 20th century would find themselves cracking in half as a result of the overwhelming torque of the November gale waves. This is why many ships, including the Edmund, began to be designed with intentional flex within their structure, allowing the ship to bend with the water rather than trying to rigidly fight against it. This flex had limits though, as it still needed to be rigid enough to hold the over 26,000 tons of material it would haul across the water, because if it was too flexible, then it would just bow and sink in the middle. Aside from its lanky frame, the Fitzgerald was also relatively short, and by short I mean short in height. When loaded or ballasted down, the ship would stand between just under 12 feet to just over 14 feet out of the water. This, in theory, provided great stability as it traveled calm or moderately rough waters of the lake, with so much of its weight beneath the surface that its center of gravity was well below the waterline, even with its relatively shallow draft. However, this became a problem as seas grew higher. With so much weight under the water and so little height above it, even with several feet of flex built into the design, once waves reached 20 feet or higher, they would be at a point where they fully engulf even the highest points of the ship, slamming into it like a freight train hitting a semi-truck. For as brutal as this may sound, the designers were aware of the issue, and as a result, they added 4 main electric bilge pumps capable of dumping 7,000 gallons of water over the ship every minute each. It also had 2 backup pumps, each capable of pumping 2,000 gallons of water per minute. Now, this may seem like a lot, which it is, but you have to remember that a 10-foot wave that's hitting the side of the Edmund Fitzgerald would have about 60,000 gallons of water in it. And that's just one 10-foot wave. Just the portion that hits the Edmund. Another issue was the fact that all 6 of these pumps were situated at the stern end of the aftmost bulkhead, designed to have water, quote, drain like a bathtub if necessary. This, of course, is a bit of a problem if you're in the middle of sloshing around in relatively significant seas, as water that collects near the front of the vessel when it's dropping down in the front of a wave, or a lower set of waves, would then be incapable of being pumped out. And any more water that might come in at that point would lower the bow of the ship even further, making it easier for water to come in and create a feedback loop. Now, one design element that was intended to prevent such an issue on the Fitz was the ballast tanks that it had within its double hull, of which it had 14. These were filled when the cargo holds were empty to keep the ship low enough in the water for the propellers to actually function, since if it ran fully empty, the over 19-foot wide propeller would only have a fraction of its actual diameter touch the water. That is how much they calculated for the ship to be weighed down. The ballast tanks also helped keep the ship upright in the case of any uneven distribution of weight in the holds. The only downside is that if the outer hull were to be damaged in a given section, the ballast tank within it would be irreparable at sea. Now, the way to keep yourself from potentially damaging the ship's hull while underway is to be cognizant of your surroundings, knowing your charts as the captain or pilot, and keeping an eye out for obstructions above and below the waterline. A common means of keeping aware of real-time depth values, even at the time, are the usage of soundage gear or depth gauges, which use sonic pings to bounce off the bottom and return to the transducer that sent it, and the time it takes between the ping and its return is calculated by a computer, and the depth is provided in real time. It is an incredibly handy tool in nautical navigation, especially in unfamiliar territory. And it's a real shame that the Edmund Fitzgerald didn't have it. That's right, one of the most common tools within nautical navigation, even in the 1970s, the Edmund Fitzgerald did not have. No, they relied on a much more traditional method, which involved a crew member standing on deck with a 10-inch lead weight, throwing it over the side, and counting how many knots slipped through their fingers before it stopped moving, i.e. hit the bottom. So let's recap. The Edmund Fitzgerald was built with what were even at the time known to be unsafe dimensions. Granted, that's as a result of the standard on the Great Lakes, but we move on. It was also built with safety pumps placed in an unreliable position, in a ship with unrecoverable ballast tanks if they were damaged, and no means of safe or reliable depth finding in conditions which prevented crew members from being on deck. Now, granted, in most scenarios, none of these elements would be pushed to their limits, let alone multiple of them. And the Fitz had seen storms before, so how could this one be any different? In 2019, researchers Thomas R. Hultquist, Michael R. Dutter, and David J. Schwab published an article in the American Meteorological Society called Re-examination of the 9-10 November 1975 Edmund Fitzgerald Storm using today's technology. Within that article, the researchers took every data point that they could find of the days in which the storm lasted. There wasn't much. Over the course of the storm, there were 31 surface weather observations taken by ships on Lake Superior over a 42-hour period, providing less than one reading per hour over an area roughly the size of South Carolina. And only one of these readings was in the vicinity of the Edmund Fitzgerald at any point of its journey. The team implemented all data points that they had from the beginning of the storm into the Regional Atmospheric Modeling System, or RAMS version 4.4, and they let the simulation run from midnight UTC on November 9th to 0600 UTC on November 11th. Wave condition simulation was performed by the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory wind wave model, driven by the wind temperature output from the atmospheric simulation, which was covering the same period of time. And for extra clarity, the simulation is designed to input starting values only, the atmospheric conditions at midnight UTC. Any of the values that are generated after midnight UTC are a result of the modeled simulations emulating how the initial values would have played out. There is no interference from the researchers or external forces on the model after the initial numbers are input into the system and they hit start. From that point forward, they're just comparing what the model predicted happened to the actual values they were able to assemble. Also, for those who were unaware, as I was prior to writing this, UTC is the Coordinated Universal Time, often utilized in scientific formats like this, and it similarly lines up with GMT, or Greenwich Mean Time, with the only difference that UTC starts at midnight and GMT starts at midday. Local time of the incident at UTC midnight would have been about 7 p.m. Now I'm going to be using UTC from here on out as it was the time format used in the article, but I did transcribe meters measurements into feet to keep relations a little bit more familiar, and because of course, freedom units. After the simulation ran, the researchers combed through the data points that it provided, comparing them to the data points developed with the real ones that were captured through the 48-hour period of the actual storm. All of the data was remarkably close matches, and some of them even being exact, lending to the accuracy of the simulation. Below, I'm going to give a summarized timeline of the meteorological events of the simulation, at times compared with the values captured during the actual event by ships in the related positions, to enhance understanding of the accuracy of the model. This timeline will help give you an understanding, after having learned how waves form and what makes them dangerous, of just how intense the last moments of the Edmund Fitzgerald really were. Now, I highly recommend you check out the article from which this information has been transcribed. It's going to be a lot more in-depth, and I think the authors of the article really deserve the credit that comes with having put together this level of work. At 1800 UTC on November 9th, 75 minutes before the departure of the Edmund Fitzgerald, winds were out of the east from 10 to 15 knots, with waves at about 1 to 1.5 feet or less over western Lake Superior. Ships that were already out on the western Lake Superior at this time indicated winds of about 15 knots from the northeast. At 2100 UTC on November 9th, winds increased from the northeast to 20 knots. At this point, the Edmund had departed and it was heading directly into this wind. At midnight UTC on November 10th, winds were originating from the northeast at 25 knots or greater within the simulation, and actual ship observations over western Lake Superior indicate winds from northeast at 24 to 28 knots, correlating pretty strongly with the simulation. At 0600 UTC on November 10th, the simulation said that winds were coming from the northeast from 30 to 35 knots and waves of approximately 10 feet. At this time in the real world, the Edmund Fitzgerald reported winds from the northeast at 52 knots, but that may be due to the travel speed being directly into the wind, causing their ship relative speed to be greater than the ground relative speed of the wind. And it correlates pretty directly with their headway subtracted from 52 knots. You do get about 30 to 35 knots of wind. Giving credence to the accuracy of the simulation at this time as well, the Edmund Fitzgerald reported the wave height for this date, time, and location as about 9 feet, which is a near exact match to the simulation. Two other ships in the vicinity of the Edmund Fitzgerald at this time reported winds of 32 knots, which also gives credence to the simulation and also the likelihood that the Edmund Fitzgerald was not taking into account their own speed when recording the wind. By the time of the early morning of November 10th, the low center moves over the eastern Lake Superior. This would cause conditions to calm slightly as the air within this center low is moving up as opposed to drawing air in from outside of it. There would still be turbulent wind amongst the center low, but for the most part, the strongest winds are going to be that feeding into the low, that is rising into the higher atmosphere. By noon UTC on the 10th, winds were at 15 to 25 knots in variable directions, with the strongest winds coming from the southeast at 30 to 35 knots. Now, at this time in real world, the Edmund Fitzgerald reported northeast 35 knot winds and wave heights of 10 feet. And the wave height simulations of the Edmund Fitzgerald location at that time matched those reports. And other ships in the vicinity at that time were reporting winds of about 23 knots. By 1500 UTC, the low center is right near the Edmund Fitzgerald as it turns southeast, and the winds are about 10 knots. Simultaneously, the winds on the western portion of Lake Superior were increasing, coming from the northwest at over 30 knots, which correlates well with the fact that it was feeding into the center low that was right about over the Edmund Fitzgerald and the more calm area beneath it. By 1800 UTC, that center low is moved northeast of Lake Superior entirely, which is intensifying the northwesterly winds over the lake, most notably the over 40-knot winds over the south-central Lake Superior, likely accelerated by the coastal convergence north of the Huron Mountains. At this point, wave heights were building to nearly 20 feet over south-central and southeast Lake Superior. At this time, the Edmund Fitzgerald was just north of Michipicoten Island, with winds being reported as 25 to 30 knots, and other ships in the area measured winds anywhere from 20 to 40 knots. By 2100 UTC on November 10th, the winds were from the northwest at over 45 knots, just north of the Huron Mountains, and over 40 knots from the northwest, just north of the Kinawa Peninsula. And these winds were spreading to the east, towards the Fitzgerald, and increasing wave heights to beyond 20 feet. At midnight UTC on November 11th, westerly northwest winds at over 45 knots were covering most of southeastern Lake Superior, with gale-force winds at 35 knots extending deep into western Lake Superior. At this point in the evening, the Edmund Fitzgerald was located at the extreme eastern edge of the region of the highest winds, which would also be the location of the highest waves in the entire system for the entire duration of the storm. Waves were marked as over 23 feet at midnight UTC and maxing out at 25.5 feet around 1 a.m. UTC. The simulation showed max sustained winds, that's not including gusts, it's just the wind that perpetually was blowing, at 65 knots, with a max wave height of 23 feet, with a potential for 46-foot high waves, assuming rogue wave combination waves. And I have to reiterate, these were the most severe conditions of the entire storm and the most severe location of the entire storm, all centered on the Edmund Fitzgerald's exact position. The Arthur M. Anderson, just the short miles behind the Edmund Fitzgerald, was reporting winds from the northwest at 50 knots, correlating with the 47-knot winds that the simulation said were at its location at the time. At 15 minutes past midnight UTC, the Edmund Fitzgerald is lost. When the Arthur M. Anderson entered the location from which the Edmund Fitzgerald was lost, not long after it had disappeared, the waves and wind had subsided slightly. And by slightly, I mean the waves were reaching anywhere between 18 to 25 feet, and the winds were gusting anywhere between 70 and 75 knots. At 0300 UTC, the westerly northwest winds decreased to 45 knots, with the gale force confined to the eastern Lake Superior. And by 0600 UTC, the west-northwesterly winds died down to 35 to 40 knots, and waves of 16.5 feet or less over the eastern Lake Superior, with peaks still reaching 20 feet in the far southeast extreme of Lake Superior. A ship within the eastern Lake Superior region reported winds of 30 knots and waves of 15 feet. And in the more calm area in the central Lake Superior region, a ship reported winds of 28 knots and 6.5-foot waves. Though the conditions of this storm were exceptional, and the tragedy of the Edmund Fitzgerald just as exceptional, the unfortunate reality of the situation is that these types of conditions on the Great Lakes are not as uncommon as one might think. Winds of 65 knots or greater on Lake Superior have a return period of 20 years, which doesn't mean that they come once every 20 years, it's just their likelihood, but it also means that though they're not typical, they are very much not rare. Storms impact the Great Lakes every year, And storms that produce the conditions like that of the 9th, 10th, and 11th of November 1975 occur every 2 to 6 years on average. Ships of all sizes, including over 900-foot-long freighters, continue to travel the Great Lakes for commercial and recreational purposes to this day, and are therefore still at risk of encountering such conditions as this in the future. Modernized observation and forecast systems have helped to substantially improve forecasts for the Great Lakes over the past 30 years, which has allowed for greater advance notice of storms and has helped to avoid such severe conditions being encountered by ships rather than them having to endure it. But that technology has not made it an impossibility. It's still important for us to understand what happened and what causes led to the disaster of the Edmund Fitzgerald if we want to be able to avoid repeating history once again. Despite the new safety capabilities and requirements that modern vessels have, it's important to remember that this is still a possible experience to encounter. These conditions can and will occur again. All that we can do is to remember those that came before us, honor those who never came home, and understand how the conditions of those storms led to tragedy so that we might prevent further tragedies from occurring in the future. Mattis did a great job of recounting the stories of the men that sailed the Edmund Fitzgerald, and it was a real honor to be able to put this video together, having known the story for so long, but never to this depth from which we've covered it. And the only thing I can say is I'm grateful to have the opportunity that we have to be able to cover stories like this. These men deserve to be honored and remembered, and I just hope that wherever they are now, they've got fair winds and calm seas.
If you didn't grow up on the Great Lakes, then your first introduction to the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald was almost certainly from Gordon Lightfoot's song. And in fact, I saw a news article, actually just a couple of days before we recorded this episode, which suggested that without the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the song, nobody might remember the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the event, at least not people who didn't grow up on the Great Lakes. I think that that's probably true. My stepdad grew up in Lake Erie, and he remembered the story of the event, but even for him, to a large extent, that memory is tied to this song. And so for me, as a musician, I did want to do a little bit of a dive into it, and again, The Gales of November is such an amazing book. It has a whole chapter on this. As I was reading through it, I was struck by the story of the song almost as much as the story of the ship. Obviously, there's so much more to the story of the ship going down. But the thing is, this song almost seems like it had to happen. And maybe the other musicians listening will understand that, or maybe even as the non-musicians, I'm not trying to sound pedantic or special. It's just, I was reading the story, and Gordon Lightfoot had been playing around with this melody, the now famous one you've heard on the radio, that you've heard in memes, that you've heard on TikTok, in YouTube videos, that if you're interested, you can go hear a cover of on our Patreon that I sang myself. Gordon Lightfoot was playing around with an old Irish funeral dirge. And for those who don't know, that's kind of it's like a song about somebody's death, just in general. So that's why you have this folksy, almost Celtic sound to it, which makes sense when you're thinking about, Canada. And Gordon was Canadian. Is Canadian? I'm actually not sure if he's still alive. He was alive. He passed away in 2023. I think it was 1974 that he started playing around with this melody. And then 1975 rolls around, the Edmund Fitzgerald goes down, and Lightfoot, who had been a recreational sailor on the Great Lakes for most of his life, he started thinking about it. And he then read the Newsweek article, which I believe was around 578 words, something like that. And this is the article that kind of broke the story for the world. It had been reported around the Great Lakes before, but Newsweek was when the whole world, about 2 weeks after, really got the whole story, with the 29 times that the church bell rang, and the captain wiring in and all of that. So Lightfoot set about basically writing this eulogy to these sailors. And it comes out to, I think, about 460 some words. So it's almost as long as the article. But what's really spectacular, and the reason I said that it seems like the song had to happen, like it almost created itself, is that when you read the lyrics, there is some poetry in it. There's some license taken, but not in a way that makes it inaccurate to the events. Any inaccuracies in the song are mainly due to the lack of information available to Lightfoot at the time. But what really struck me about it is that you can tell there was something in Gordon Lightfoot after he wrote these lyrics, after he had put them to the music. The song wanted to come out, and he never felt like it was ready. And so he's sitting in the studio in 1976, recording an album. The same album that The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is on now, and the song for which that album is most famous. And he had been practicing with his musicians. They were all really good, the rest of the guys in the band. And they had all heard him noodling around with this melody. They'd all heard some of the words. And all of them had sort of played a little bit to it, along to it with him noodling and everything, except the drummer. And so they come to Thursday afternoon of this week they'd booked to record. And one of them goes, hey, like, why don't we just try to lay the track down? And Gordon, of course, like, it's not ready. I don't know. I don't think it's ready yet. I'm not even sure I want to release it. Would it be right to release it? And the producer, and I didn't write this part down, to be honest with you guys. The producer basically said, well, you guys booked the studio for the whole week. You still got a day and a half. And I got to point out that getting, I think it was 10 songs done in 3.5 days is nuts. That is incredibly impressive that they were able to just lay that down in a few days. Point is, the producer's like, hey, you guys have the studio. You might as well just try to record it. And so they go to start recording the song, and the drummer, again, had never actually played it. So he's like, hey, Gordon, when do you want me to come in? And Gordon says, oh, I'll just cue you. I'll just cue you in. So they start playing it. You get through the first two main verses, and the drummer, whose name is escaping me at the moment, he said to Bacon that, or it might not have been to Bacon, it might have been in a documentary or another book, again, riffing. He said that he thought Gordon had forgotten to cue him in. And so he was ready to just kind of sit there and be like, okay, I guess this is just going to be guitar and piano and vocals. And then just before 1:34 into the song, Gordon turns around and he gives him the nod. And the drummer hits that dun dun dun, where you get into the wind in the wires gave a tattletale sound, that part, and they just played through the rest of it. And that was the first take they ever did of the song. And so after that, they're all like, all right, let's try it again. Let's do it again, and let's try to fix this, and let's try to fix that. And just this perfectionism that kind of comes in with musical recording, especially with people who are professional musicians. And they spend the next day and a half, the rest of Thursday, all of Friday, just re-recording the song, trying to make it technically better and everything. And then they go back and they listen to the recordings. And the one thing they all agreed is that that first take was the best one. And what's incredible about that first take is that when I say that when you listen to this song, you're hearing the first take they ever did. That's impressive enough. But I just want to reiterate, it's not just the first take. What you hear on that album, what you hear on that record, on the radio, wherever, is the first time that band ever played that song. They had never played it together before. The only man who had ever played that song all the way through was Gordon Lightfoot, and the first take was the perfect one. So when I say that the song needed to happen, the song basically brought itself into existence. The melody was already there, the event happened, the article happened, Gordon Lightfoot put it all to music, and it just came into being. The very first take, the very first time they played it, that was the one. I can't really think of a more perfect eulogy for these men who went down. I don't try to preach religion on this show, and I'm not even saying that my God is necessarily the right one, but it's things like that that really make you believe that there's something bigger than us, that there's something that works its way into the spirituality of the world we inhabit. Because I think about that fact, that this tragic event happens, and the families really didn't get the justice they deserved. There was not nearly a high enough payout for the lives lost. Because the fact of the matter is, the ship was overloaded, and the companies had been lobbying the government to loosen regulations. They were allowing people to get away with things. They were offering bonuses that incentivized people to take risky actions. You could be punished as a captain if you chose not to take your ship out. due to hazardous conditions. Gordon Lightfoot maybe even would probably feel that he wasn't the author of this song. He was the vessel of this song. He was the way that this story was communicated, and through the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the song, something that the company responsible would probably loved for it to become just a flash in the pan, a footnote in history, is something that teenagers today know about, all because of this song. You know, the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald will probably never be recovered from the bottom of Lake Superior. That line, Superior, they said, never gives up her dead, it's pretty accurate. But thanks to Gordon Lightfoot, those men will always be remembered. And I think that is one hell of a legacy, not just for Ernest McSorely and his men, but also for Gordon Lightfoot as a musician. I mean, what an incredible honor as a musician to be part of that story. To be able to say to yourself something that would have been forgotten, some great tragedy that would have been lost to history for all intents and purposes. Those families, they get to know that people cared, that their loved ones didn't just pass for no reason and nobody would remember it. They get to know that this meant something, and thanks to them, thanks to the song, thanks to everything, there have been changes made. There's safety measures that now people truly understand and respect the danger and the sacrifices that their loved ones made. And I wasn't able to get into it in this video, but I mean, the importance of the Great Lakes shipping industry to the United States as a nation, economically and militarily and everything, cannot be understated. These 9,000 or some men who would be on the lake in a given year, they drove America. Like, without them, the iron industry here doesn't exist as we knew it. Without them, there are millions of jobs that don't exist, and America may never have become the behemoth that it is today. All of us in this country, and quite a few people in Canada, have the standard of living that we do because of the incredibly difficult and dangerous job that these men did, and the thing they lost their lives for. It's not just the families of the men aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's not just the wives and the sons and the daughters. It's all of us who benefited from the work these men did. And I think that is very worthy of remembering. I'll admit it feels a little weird to go into the promo segment of the video here, but if you do like what we do here at the Lore Lodge and you want to support us, the easiest way to do that is go over to Patreon. It's $1 a month. And there you can check out ad-free versions of these videos. You can get some of our scripts. I will post any scripts as they are requested. And I'm trying to get as many of them up as possible just after reformatting. And hopefully, as of this video being up, you'll be able to catch a cover that I did with our editor, PJ, who does History Unhinged, of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. PJ and I play in a couple of bands here in town. And speaking of PJ and History Unhinged, you can check out that show as well. I did recently hear from Wendigoon. Looks like Weird Bible might be coming back sometime soon. Let's hope, but he's just been extremely busy. You can also purchase our merch over at Bunker Branding. You can get our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company, and I'd say the most important thing to do if you're trying to get more involved with the channel and the community and to help support us is to join our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge. Also, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. YouTube cares way too much about the notification bell for how poorly it works, but please hit that. You can also catch this show as well as our live show on Spotify, or you can catch our live show live here on YouTube at 7 p.m. on Monday nights, and we've got to go do that in about an hour and a half. So we will see some of you there, or I guess we'll have seen some of you there.